First, I want to say that I strongly support H.R. 40. I've been a sponsor of this legislation since I came to Congress in 2007. It was originally sponsored in 1989 by the distinguished former chairman of this committee, Mr. John Conyers, whose picture is on the wall here, an outstanding congressperson and an outstanding chairman. And I hope that this committee will report this out favorably to the full House. The enslavement of people of African ancestry in America was a crime against humanity, the impacts of which we as a society continue to grapple with today in everything from racially unequal economic opportunities to disparate health outcomes to the plague of unjustified police violence against Black Americans. Slavery was this country's original sin. Our Constitution protected it, embodying various compromises that gave disproportionate power to slave states. The 3/5 clause counted a slave as 3/5 of a person for population counts, which in turn gave disproportionate representation to slave states in the House of Representatives. Otherwise, they were considered as property. They were only considered as persons to give their slave-holding states, political organizations, and teams more power. The Constitution also created an electoral college, a system of electing the President of the United States that gave slave states another avenue to exercise disproportionate influence over national affairs, and only by counting African Americans in some way other than as property to give the slave master and his power structure in that state additional powers over our federal government. It is only fitting then that in the midst of a continuing reckoning over police mistreatment of Black people, a continuing assault on the voting rights of Black citizens, and a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted Black Americans, we should be holding this historic markup of H.R. 40, the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans Act. It is a study to tell us what they propose. We don't know the answer. H.R. 40 would create this commission to study the history of slavery in America, the role of the federal and state governments in supporting slavery and racial discrimination, other forms of discrimination against the descendants of slaves, and the lingering effects of slavery on African Americans. The commission will also make recommendations as to appropriate ways to educate the American public about its findings and appropriate remedies in light of its findings. I applaud Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, the current lead sponsor of this legislation, for her leadership on this bill, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor. I also was proud to chair 2 hearings on H.R. 40 before the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. I commend Chairman Nadler, another longtime sponsor of this bill, for holding this first ever markup of H.R. 40. But the greatest credit for H.R. 40 belongs to our former colleague and former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, my friend and mentor, the late John Conyers, Jr. He first introduced this legislation over 30 years ago and reintroduced it in every Congress until his retirement. And for those who may not know, the reason it's H.R. 40 is because John Conyers chose that number, because Republicans promised 40 acres and a mule to the freedmen. The party of Lincoln said, we will give you 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman, that was a promise, and it would have been fulfilled, and African Americans would have had to step up and had an opportunity not to have the economic deprivations they've had over the years, but for John Wilkes Booth, the assassination of President Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson coming president. An honest reckoning with the federal government's role in protecting the Institute of Slavery has been a leading priority of my congressional career. In 2007, less than 2 months into my tenure, I introduced H.Res. 194, an apology by the House of Representatives for its role in perpetuating both slavery and its noxious offspring, Jim Crow. The House ultimately passed this resolution by a voice vote, and again, I give credit to Mr. Conyers for bringing it to the floor. As I noted in my resolution, it was not just slavery itself that was wrong, but it was also, quote, the visceral racism against persons of African descent upon which, unquote, American slavery depended, a racism that went on to become, quote, entrenched in the nation's social fabric. This is an evil that we must continue to confront today as our nation still struggles with the legacy of the anti-Black racism that undergirded slavery and Jim Crow. We see this in statistics that paint a bleak picture. According to the Census Bureau, 18.8% of Black Americans live in poverty in 2019, compared to 7.3% of non-Hispanic whites who live in poverty. The Washington Post reported last year that in 2016, the net worth of black households was $13,024, which was 10% of the $149,703 net worth of non-Hispanic white households. Limited access to wealth-building resources and opportunities have led to this stark disparity. For instance, black Americans continue to face discrimination in the workplace. They also have limited access to educational opportunities. According to the National Education Association, the high school graduation rates for blacks was 67% compared to a nationwide average of 81%. They also continue to face racial segregation in housing, discrimination in the availability of quality health care services, health deserts, and in most other major facets of life. Health deserts, food deserts are common in almost every predominant black neighborhood in our country. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated the effects of these structural racial disparities. Enacting H.R. 40 will be an important step in finding effective long-term solutions to these problems, ones that can trace their origins to our nation's shameful history of slavery and anti-black racism. As Professor Charles Ogletree of Harvard Law School noted, and he spoke to a committee of this committee years ago, the concept of reparations does not necessarily mean payments to individuals, but rather a focus on the poorest of the poor, including efforts to address comprehensively the problems of those who have not substantially benefited from integration or affirmative action. Once again, I commend the chairman, the sponsor, all members who are co-sponsors, and President Lincoln and General Sherman. And I urge the party of Lincoln to rise up to the calls of President Lincoln and General Sherman to do right. I urge the committee to support H.R. 40 and to report it favorably to the House. I yield back the balance of my time.